Have you ever noticed how people who start questioning the most fundamental structures of their lives often become strangers within their own families? There is something deeply unsettling about seeing someone close to you to awaken to realities. The rest of the group prefers to keep asleep. It's as if in a dark room where everyone has tacitly agreed not to mention the darkness, someone suddenly lights a match. That small flame not only illuminates the space, but exposes all the shadows, every corner we'd rather not see. And the instinctive reaction of those who are comfortable in the darkness is rarely gratitude. On the contrary, it's often hostility, as if the one who brought the light had violated some unspoken social contract to keep the collective illusions intact. This phenomenon isn't new in human history, but it takes on particular forms in our age of accelerated transformation, especially when it unfolds within the family unit and involves men awakening to deeper levels of existential, political, or spiritual consciousness. To understand this, we need to take a few steps back and look at how family structures have evolved throughout human history. For most of our existence as a species, the family wasn't just a unit of kinship, but one of economic survival and physical protection. In hunter-gatherer societies, agrarian civilizations, and even the early stages of the industrial age, the family functioned as a cohesive organism where conformity to group norms wasn't just a matter of social comfort, but literally of life and death. A member who strayed too far from established values or behaviors wasn't just an inconvenience, but a potential danger to collective survival. Imagine a man in a small medieval village who begins to question the authority of the church or the traditions of farming. He wouldn't only be causing ideological discomfort, he'd be threatening the family's access to vital resources and community protection. As we move into the modern era, those immediate survival pressures have lessened, but the deep psychological structures that govern family dynamics have remained surprisingly unchanged. The modern family still operates to a great extent as a system of shared beliefs, an ecosystem of mutually validated narratives that provide comfort and meaning. When one member, especially a man, traditionally associated with stability and continuity, starts to question those foundational narratives, he isn't merely expressing a divergent opinion. He is effectively destabilizing the very fabric that keeps the family unit cohesive. Here we reach a crucial point for understanding why more conscious men are often rejected by their families. Awakening rarely happens in a partial or compartmentalized way. When a man starts questioning, for example, the economic structures that governed his professional life, that questioning often expands into other areas. He may begin to examine the power dynamics in his marriage, his family's consumption habits, the values he's passing to his children, the true motivations behind his religious traditions. In other words, the awakened man doesn't just disagree on specific issues, he begins to operate from an entirely different paradigm, one that renders many of the family's basic assumptions invalid or at least questionable. Imagine a man who has worked 2 decades in a corporation contributing to products he now recognizes as harmful to the environment or to public health. His awakening isn't simply about changing jobs. It's about confronting the fact that much of his identity social status, and the material privileges he provided his family were built upon something he now sees as fundamentally flawed. How will his wife, who may have built her own identity around the social status his job provided, react to that awakening? How will his children, accustomed to a certain lifestyle, process this transformation? The cognitive dissonance that arises doesn't affect only him, it reverberates throughout the entire family system. It's also important to note that this rejection isn't always the result of malice or conscious pettiness on the part of relatives. It's a form of psychological self-preservation. When one family member begins articulating uncomfortable truths or living according to radically different values, he inadvertently becomes a mirror reflecting back to the others the contradictions and compromises in their own lives. The mother, who spent decades suppressing her personal ambitions to raise her children, may feel deeply threatened when her adult son questions traditional gender roles. The father, who endured an alienating job his whole life to support the family, may feel his sacrifice devalued when his son chooses a simpler life with less material status, but greater alignment with his values. In these cases, the rejection of the more conscious member isn't a denial of his worth as a person, but a desperate attempt to preserve the narratives that give meaning and coherence to the other's life choices. The situation becomes even more complex when we consider the dynamics of masculinity in contemporary societies. Historically, a man's social worth has been tightly tied to his capacity for productive conformity, especially within the context of industrial and post-industrial capitalism. A good man is one who takes his place in the economic machine without asking too many questions, who materially provides for his family, who defends existing values and institutions. Awakening often leads to a re-evaluation of these masculine metrics of worth, which can be perceived not just as a rejection of the broader socio-economic system, but as an abdication of conventional masculine responsibilities. Take, for instance, a man who, after years working in finance, develops a critical awareness of the inequalities perpetuated by the system he served. He decides to drastically reduce his lifestyle, perhaps move to a smaller community, devote himself to activism or socially meaningful work that pays far less. From the perspective of his expanded consciousness, he is finally living with integrity. But to his family, especially if they haven't gone through a similar awakening, he may appear to be abandoning his responsibilities, rejecting the comfort he once provided, and even seeming arrogant in his new ethical stance. The chasm between these perspectives can rarely be bridged through rational dialogue alone, because we're not talking about disagreements over facts, but about fundamentally different paradigms for perceiving and valuing reality. Modern technology has only intensified this dynamic. We live in an era of algorithmic personalization, where each person can effectively create their own informational reality. Two members of the same family may be exposed to radically different sets of information, reinforcing divergent worldviews. The man who begins to research issues like environmental sustainability or economic injustice soon finds himself in an informational environment entirely different from that of his relatives. Over time, this informational divergence translates into a divergence of values, priorities, and even shared language. Family members literally stop understanding each other, not for lack of love or effort, but because they have come to inhabit distinct conceptual realities. There's also an important generational factor at play. Many men who experience profound awakenings of consciousness in midlife are caught between their parents' generation, often more rigid and traditional, and their children's, which tends to be more fluid and skeptical of hierarchy. They may find themselves in a generational no man's land, rejected by the elders for abandoning tradition, and viewed skeptically by the young, who may see their transformation as insufficient or too late. This in-between position can be profoundly lonely, contributing to the sense of alienation even within one's own household. I need to pause and ask you directly, which aspect of this awakening of consciousness resonates most with your own experience? Have you ever felt this kind of distance from those close to you once you began questioning structures you previously accepted without reflection? Many of us keep such experiences to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming pretentious or of deepening the divide. But your reflections are valid and likely shared by more people than you think. Share in the comments, my awakening created distance when I started questioning. Your voice might help create a space where we can honestly discuss these painful personal transformations instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these experiences together, we can begin to imagine ways to integrate our personal growth with our deepest connections. Another complicating factor is what could be called the false awakening effect. Human consciousness doesn't expand linearly or uniformly. The man who genuinely begins to awaken to the limitations and contradictions of his previous paradigm initially passes through a phase that could be described as a kind of enlightened arrogance. In this stage, he may become dogmatic about his new perceptions, impatient with those who don't share his vision, even condescending in his attempts to educate others. This behavior, though understandable as part of transformation, often provokes unnecessary resistance and may be mistaken by relatives for mere rebellion or a midlife crisis. True deepening of consciousness eventually leads to renewed humility, to an understanding that awakening is a continuous process, not a final state of enlightenment that separates the awakened from the asleep. Yet many men never reach this more mature stage, remaining trapped in a partial awakening that is as dogmatic as their previous unconscious state, merely with a different set of absolute beliefs. It's also essential to acknowledge the economic dimension of this phenomenon. The modern family, especially in the middle class, often functions as an interdependent economic unit. The financial and professional choices of one member directly affect the material well-being of the others. When a man undergoes a transformation that leads him to question his traditional economic role, it's not just an abstract philosophical challenge, it's a very concrete threat to the family's established way of life. The wife, who may have made career sacrifices to support her husband's path, can feel particularly vulnerable when he starts questioning the value of conventional success. The children who grew up expecting financial support for education or independence may feel betrayed. Here, The rejection of the more conscious man has roots not only in ideological differences, but in very real material anxieties. Human history offers us countless examples of this pattern. Think of figures like Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, or countless ordinary people whose names we do not know, but who went through similar transformations. The pattern is surprisingly consistent. The individual who awakens to deeper truths often faces their greatest resistance, not from declared enemies, but from those closest to them, those who would theoretically benefit the most from their expanded awareness. No prophet is accepted in his own land, says the ancient proverb, capturing this timeless dynamic. What is less discussed is how this pattern manifests in the intimate dynamics of the modern family, and specifically how it affects contemporary men who are navigating transformations of consciousness amid the peculiar pressures of our time. Perhaps one of the most painful dynamics in this process is what we might call the mirror effect. When a family member awakens to a deeper understanding of the contradictions and illusions that permeate modern life, they inevitably become a mirror for others, reflecting aspects of reality that we would rather not see. The corporate executive who abandons a lucrative career for ethical reasons becomes an uncomfortable mirror for the brother-in-law who remains in a similar position. The mother who begins to question patterns of consumption and materialism reflects an inconvenient truth to the sister who has based much of her identity on possessions and appearances. In such cases, the hostility directed toward the more conscious family member is rarely about the specific ideas they express, but about the existential discomfort their mere presence evokes in others. At the center of this dynamic lies the primal fear of isolation. Human beings are, above all, social creatures. Our need for belonging is not just a preference, but a deep psychological necessity rooted in our evolution as a species. For hundreds of thousands of years, isolation from the group meant almost certain death. Our brains evolved to fear social exclusion nearly as much as we fear direct physical threats. When a man begins to articulate truths that threaten his belonging within the family group, he is essentially navigating between two forms of suffering: the pain of inauthenticity, living against his expanded conscience, or the pain of distance from those he loves most. It is no wonder that this dilemma often results in a kind of paralysis, where the more conscious man tries to live with one foot in each world, unable to fully integrate his inner truth with his closest relationships. This tension is even more pronounced in societies that value individualism in rhetoric, but punish true individuality in practice. Modern Western culture nominally celebrates authenticity and self-discovery. Yet our social, economic, and family systems often require a high degree of conformity to function without friction. The man who takes seriously the cultural imperative to be true to yourself and follows that directive to its logical conclusions often discovers that his authenticity is welcomed only as long as it remains within certain acceptable boundaries. A midlife crisis that results in a sports car is tolerated as harmless, perhaps even comical. A midlife crisis that leads to a fundamental questioning of capitalist values or traditional family structures is perceived as a far more serious threat. The irony is that often the man undergoing such an awakening is simply trying to live according to the very values what his family nominally supports. The executive who leaves an ethically compromised job to work in something more aligned with his values is often merely trying to honor the lessons about integrity he learned in his upbringing. The father who begins to question unsustainable consumption patterns is often motivated by the desire to ensure a livable world for his children and grandchildren. From this perspective, the family's rejection of the more conscious man reveals one of the central contradictions of contemporary life. We profess certain values in the abstract, yet organize our daily lives according to pressures and incentives that often contradict those values. The man who tries to resolve this contradiction becomes an uncomfortable reminder of the cognitive dissonance others prefer to ignore. There is also a significant gender dimension in this dynamic. In traditional patriarchal societies, the man was supposedly the moral and spiritual authority of the family. With the partial erosion of these structures in modern societies, combined with the persistence of traditional masculine expectations in other areas, the contemporary man often finds himself in a paradoxical position. He is expected to be both the stable material provider and the spiritual moral pioneer of the family, roles that can come into direct conflict when an awakening of consciousness occurs. The woman who undergoes a similar transformation of consciousness may face other forms of resistance, but she is rarely seen as abdicating a central responsibility of her gender role in the same way. Let us now consider the psychological effects of this rejection on the man undergoing the process of expanded consciousness. The resulting isolation can have deeply destabilizing effects. Many men, upon finding themselves distanced from their families as a result of their inner growth, experience periods of intense doubt. They begin to question the validity of their new perceptions, to wonder whether the emotional cost of their authenticity is truly justifiable. Some end up regressing, suppressing their newly discovered truths to preserve family harmony, often with devastating consequences for their long-term mental and spiritual health. Others continue their transformation, accepting the distance as a necessary cost, yet carry with them a deep sadness for not being able to share their inner growth with those they love most. This existential crossroads is not merely a personal or family drama, but a microcosmic reflection of dilemmas we face as a society and as a species. Humanity as a whole is at a moment of potential awakening of consciousness. We are confronting uncomfortable truths about environmental sustainability, economic inequality, the limitations of our political systems, and the unintended consequences of our technologies. But just as the individual who awakens faces resistance within his family, the segments of society that articulate these inconvenient truths face fierce resistance from those invested in maintaining the status quo. The dynamic is fractal, repeating itself at different scales, from the family nucleus to the global community. So how do we navigate this treacherous terrain? How can a man awakening to an expanded consciousness honor his inner truth without unnecessarily alienating those he loves. There are no simple or universal solutions, but some guiding principles emerge from the collective experience of those who have crossed this territory before us. First, it is crucial to recognize that authentic awakening of consciousness includes an expansion not only of intellect, but also of empathy and compassion. The truly conscious man understands that his family is not simply wrong or asleep, but operating from the paradigm they know, facing their own fears and limitations. He recognizes that his own consciousness is an evolving process, not a final state of enlightenment that separates him from the unenlightened. This humility is essential for keeping channels of communication open. Second, timing and pacing matter. Deep transformations of consciousness often occur during moments of crisis or rupture, but their integration into daily life is a gradual process that may take years or even decades. The conscious man learns to discern when to express his most challenging truths and when to focus on common ground still shared with his family. He recognizes that not every moment is equally conducive to transformative conversations, and that trying to force others to keep up with his process can be counterproductive. Third, it is important to find supportive communities outside the family nucleus. Historically, those undergoing significant transformations of consciousness sought others on similar journeys, forming monastic communities, philosophical circles, artistic or political movements. Today, such communities can be found both locally and digitally. These connections provide validation, shared language, and examples of how others have navigated similar territory, reducing the pressure on the family unit to meet all needs for understanding and belonging. Fourth, recognize that integration is often possible, even when it initially seems impossible. With time and patience, families often find new balances that accommodate the expanded consciousness of their members. The man who initially seems radical and disruptive in his family's eyes may eventually be recognized as someone who opened valuable paths for everyone. This integration rarely means returning to the previous state, but rather developing a new, more flexible and inclusive family paradigm. Finally, it is vital to remain open to the possibility that one's own awakening is incomplete or partially mistaken. True expanded consciousness includes the capacity to continually question one's own conclusions, to remain open to the possibility that aspects of the worldview we reject may contain truths we are not yet seeing. The family, precisely because of its resistance to our new perspectives, can serve as a valuable counterpoint, highlighting blind spots in our understanding that we might otherwise overlook. It is also important to consider the impact of broader social structures on this family dynamic. In societies where basic material well-being is precarious and where adequate social safety nets do not exist, the pressure on a man to conform to conventional productive expectations is intensified. The challenge of integrating expanded consciousness with family responsibility is very different for a man living in a society with strong social protection, where basic needs are guaranteed regardless of individual choices, compared to a man in more Darwinian societies, where his family depends entirely on his ability to function within the dominant economic system, regardless of how he ethically evaluates that system. This structural reality reminds us that the family's rejection of the more conscious man is not merely a psychological or spiritual dynamic, but also a socio-economic and political one. The same structures that make it difficult to integrate expanded consciousness into family life also create obstacles to broader social transformation. The executive who cannot leave an ethically problematic job without compromising his family's material well-being is a microcosm of a society that cannot transition to more sustainable practices without temporarily compromising established living standards. Observing human evolution from a broader perspective, we can see this conflict as part of an ongoing evolutionary process. For most of our history as a species, survival primarily depended on group cohesion and conformity to established norms. But as we face increasingly complex existential challenges, our collective survival depends more and more on our ability to consciously transform our systems of values and behaviors. Individuals who awaken to this need for transformation before it becomes cultural consensus inevitably find themselves in a difficult position, perceived simultaneously as visionaries and as threats. Men who experience family rejection because of their expanded awareness may find comfort in recognizing that they are part of a broader evolutionary process, their personal challenges reflecting the collective dilemmas that all humanity will eventually have to face. There is also a spiritual or existential dimension to this process that transcends purely sociological or psychological explanations. Many contemplative traditions suggest that awakening to deeper realities inevitably involves a form of death and rebirth, a partial dissolution of the socially constructed personality, and the emergence of a more authentic identity rooted in transcendent values. Seen through this lens, family rejection can be understood as part of an initiatory process, a test of the individual's sincerity and depth of commitment to his inner truth. The mystical traditions of nearly all cultures contain stories of figures who had to leave their families of origin, literally or figuratively, as part of their spiritual journey, only to eventually return with wisdom that benefited the entire community. Of course, such a perspective, while potentially comforting to the individual facing rejection, does not diminish the real pain of family estrangement or magically resolve the practical dilemmas involved. Human life is lived in the continuous balance between multiple truths and responsibilities, and there is no perfect algorithm to determine when to prioritize personal authenticity over relational harmony, or vice versa. Each man going through such an awakening must navigate this terrain on his own, guided by his individual conscience and the particular circumstances of his life. What seems certain, however, is that we are at a historical moment where this phenomenon is becoming more common and more visible as the systems and institutions that structured modern society show growing signs of tension and unsustainability. More people are questioning fundamental assumptions about how we live and organize our lives. More men are awakening to the limitations of conventional definitions of success and masculine purpose, seeking new ways to integrate personal authenticity with meaningful connection. This process inevitably creates turbulence in family relationships, but it also offers unprecedented possibilities for new forms of connection based on deeper shared truths. Once the initial discomfort of transformation has been navigated, if these reflections have touched something you've been feeling but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era, and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. For those already on the path of awakening, remember that true expansion of consciousness always includes the deepening of compassion, especially toward those who do not share our particular vision. Family members who resist our transformation are not enemies, but companions on a shared human journey, navigating their own limitations and fears as we all do. The ability to maintain genuine connection through profound differences in perspective may be the truest test of how genuine our awakening is, and perhaps the most valuable contribution we can offer to a world divided by increasingly deep polarizations. Ultimately, perhaps the central paradox is this: the same awakening that initially separates us from our closest circles contains, if followed to its deepest conclusion, the seeds of a more authentic and lasting connection. The truly conscious man eventually transcends both unconscious conformity and reactive rebellion, finding a third path that integrates personal autonomy with relational responsibility. This path is rarely linear or free of setbacks, but for those with the courage to follow it, it offers the possibility of a life that simultaneously honors inner truth and the bonds that connect us to one another, even through the deepest transformations of consciousness and purpose. When you destroy an order and you don't have any alternative order, what you get is chaos. What you get is disorder. We are on really the edge of the precipice in two distinct but related ways. On the one hand, after the most peaceful era in human history of the last few decades, which was a very problematic, very violent era in many ways. I come from the Middle East, I know this perfectly well, but in comparative terms, it was still the most peaceful era in human history, characterized by unprecedented levels of cooperation and also of human prosperity. The order that enabled this is now collapsing. There is no viable alternative, at least we don't hear of one at the present. When you destroy an order and you don't have any alternative order, what you get is chaos. What you get is disorder. We are now falling into chaos, into disorder. The danger is that levels of violence, which have been historically low over the last 20, 30, 40 years, could become worse than ever because of the technologies of destruction that we are creating and amassing. It's just a tiny symbol of the times that has been commented in recent days by many people, that change in terminology in the United States from Department of Defense to Department of War.
What did you make of that? Yeah.
It's plain. There is no need of very complicated explanations. It's just shifting from defense to war. What could be more easy to understand?
Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, they had the hijab laws, which says that every woman, when she goes out, walking or even driving in her private car, she must wear the hijab. And until today, the regime had difficulty enforcing the hijab laws because they didn't have, millions of police officers that you can place on every street. A police officer, if a woman drives without a headscarf, immediately she's arrested and fined or whatever. In the last few years, they switched to relying on an AI system. Iran is now crisscrossed by surveillance cameras with facial recognition software, which recognizes automatically if in the car that just passed by the camera, the facial recognition software can identify that this is a woman, not a man, and she's not wearing the hijab, and identify her identity, find her phone number, and within half a second, they send her an SMS message saying, you broke the hijab law, your car is impounded. And it's not like there is a report that goes to the court and some human judge goes over the data and decides what to do. The AI immediately decides, okay, the car is confiscated.
Hello, everybody. And what I want to talk to you today about is the power to shape the world and the power to shape our future. About your power as leaders and as innovators, but also about the power of the human species as a whole. And the big question we are facing is whether AI is taking away humanity's power to control our future, or perhaps AI is giving humanity more power than ever before. And also, can we even speak about humanity, about a single humanity anymore? Or perhaps humanity in the era of AI is splitting into different groups, each with a radically different future. But before we get to AI, we have to say a few words about politics. The relatively stable liberal order of the early 21st century is collapsing. Instead of a cooperative order based on universal values, global institutions, and international laws, we are entering into a super competitive, chaotic world in which only one thing matters, and this one thing is brute force. Leaders like President Trump envision the world as a collection of fortresses, with each country separated from the others by high walls. Financial walls, like tariffs, military walls, cultural walls, and physical walls. This vision may have certain advantages, but it fails to address one key problem. Walled fortresses are seldom friendly. Thousands of years of history teach us that each national fortress would probably want a bit more security, prosperity, and territory for itself at the expense of the neighbors. And in the absence of universal values, global institutions, and international laws, how would rival fortresses resolve their disputes? For millennia, the vision of the world as a collection of fortresses always led to exactly the same outcome: a never-ending cycle of wars, with powerful empires conquering their weaker neighbors and eventually fighting each other for supremacy. This is already beginning to happen all around us. Wars of conquest, which were taboo since 1945, are coming back. Russia already sustained 1 million casualties in its attempt to conquer Ukraine and re-establish the Russian Empire. The Trump administration has already expressed imperial ambitions regarding Greenland, Panama, and even Canada, and seems to support Israel's conquest of Gaza. China, too, has its eyes on overseas expansion. The collapse of the old order is frightening, but it is also, of course, an opportunity to shape a better order. And the big question is, who will be the shapers? In the old liberal order, the ideal was that all humans would be shapers. It didn't matter whether you came from the USA or Brazil, whether you're white or black, a man or a woman, straight or gay, you had equal human dignity, and therefore, in theory at least, your views and interests counted for something. Sure, this liberal ideal was never fully realized. Ideals are not reality. But the liberal world was nevertheless a huge improvement over previous historical models. In the new post-liberal chaotic world, the ideal of equal human dignity is completely and openly abandoned. Instead of all humans trying to cooperate to shape a world that will be good for all humans, the current mantras are me first and might is right. A few powerful people in a handful of countries think that they have the right to shape the world for everyone. If you remember the meeting earlier this year between President Trump and President Zelensky at the White House, whenever Zelensky talked about things like justice or peace or territorial sovereignty of nations, President Trump interrupted him and said, "You don't have the cards. You don't have the cards." As we are meeting here in Sao Paulo to talk about the future of humanity, there are two questions for each of you to ponder. First, do you have any cards? Are there any cards in Sao Paulo? Or are all the cards in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow in the hands of people like Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin? The second question is perhaps even more important. Do you want to live in a world where the only thing that matters is cards? Is life ultimately just a card game with winners and losers? Now, I could have given the exact same speech that I gave now in 1939 or in 1914 or in countless other historical moments when humanity was on the brink of a major crisis. But this time, it's really different. Because as we ask ourselves, who will shape the new world of the 21st century, we need to take into account not only human shapers. For the first time in history, there are also non-human shapers on the planet, AIs. We might be quite close, maybe a few years, quite close to the moment when an algorithm would tell all humans, including Trump and Putin, you don't have the cards. As we enter the era of AI, I want to briefly explore here three questions. What is AI? What is the threat of AI? And how can all of you business leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators help humanity not just survive, but also flourish in the era of AI. So let's start. What is AI? There is so much hype around this term, AI, that the term is now inaccurately applied to almost every machine, and it is becoming difficult to know what it really means. So let me be very, very clear. AI does not mean automation. AI means agency. AI is not a tool in our hands. AI is an independent agent capable of acting and learning and changing on its own. To be an AI, it is not enough for a machine to act independently, automatically. It must also have the capacity to learn and change by itself, to make decisions by itself, and to invent new ideas by itself. As a simple example, consider a coffee machine. If you press a button and the machine automatically makes you an espresso according to a pre-programmed procedure, this is not AI. The machine doesn't learn or create anything new by itself. But suppose that as you approach the machine, even before you press any button, the machine says to you, I've been monitoring you for the last few weeks. Based on everything I've learned about you, and based on your facial expression right now, I predict that you would like to have a double espresso with 1 spoon of sugar. So I've already made you such a cup. Here, take it. That's an AI. It learned something by itself and decided something by itself. And it is really AI if the following day the machine announces, I've now invented a new drink that I call Bespresso, and I think you would like it even better than espresso. So here, try it out. I made you a cup. The confusion about AI results in part from the term itself. The term AI has been invented decades ago as an acronym for artificial intelligence. But it is inaccurate to think about AI as an artificial intelligence if by artificial we mean something that is entirely designed and controlled by humans. AI is not artificial in this sense. So it's better perhaps to think about AI as an acronym for alien intelligence. Alien not in the sense that it's coming from outer space, it doesn't. Alien in the sense that this is a non-human intelligence, it's not even an organic intelligence. It operates on completely different inorganic lines. It therefore is able to make decisions and to invent ideas that would never occur to human beings or to any other organic animal. A famous example of this was given already back in 2016 when the AI AlphaGo defeated the human Go champion Lee Sedol in Seoul. This game became justly famous, not just because AlphaGo defeated the human champion. It was the way AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol which shocked the world. Because AlphaGo, in order to win, invented new strategies for how to play the game that never occurred to any human player in thousands of years of the history of Go. Now, as long as AI invents new ways to play games or new kinds of coffee, it doesn't seem very important. But very soon, AI will invent new military strategies, new kinds of money, and even entire ideologies and religions. Consider money and finance more generally. If you recall the 2007-2008 financial crisis, You might remember that it was largely caused or started by something called CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. CDOs were financial devices invented by a handful of mathematicians and investment wizards. These financial devices were so complex that they were almost unintelligible to most humans, including politicians and regulators. And this led to an oversight failure and a global catastrophe. Now, what happens if we now allow or even encourage AIs to invent new financial devices that will be orders of magnitude more complex than CDOs and that will be utterly unintelligible to any human being? Such devices could greatly improve financial efficiency and contribute to economic growth, and they could become the bedrock of the global financial system. But what would happen to human politics when no voter or politician is able to understand and regulate finance anymore? And what happens if after a few years of unprecedented boom, the financial system suddenly busts and there isn't a single human being on earth that is able to make sense of what is happening? Now consider the implications for something like religion. Especially, let's take as an example, religions based on texts like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. For thousands of years, Judaism granted ultimate authority not to human beings, but to texts like the Bible and the Talmud. Flesh and blood rabbis nevertheless had immense power within Jewish society for the simple reason that their holy texts could never speak for themselves. They were mute. Whenever you had a question about the text, you needed a human interpreter. Rabbis are humans who know their way around many Jewish texts, from the Bible to the latest commentaries on the Talmud. This is the source of their authority. Now, over the centuries, so many Jewish texts have been composed that not even the most learned rabbi is able to read all these texts in his or her lifetime, let alone remember everything written there. But of course, this is something that an AI can easily accomplish. AI could quickly read all the Jewish texts ever composed, remember every word in every single one of these texts, and also find patterns in the texts that have so far escaped human notice, human attention, and AI could therefore use its unprecedented scriptural understanding and knowledge to produce completely new interpretations of the Holy Word. And this, of course, is true of Christianity and Islam as well. In effect, AI can start functioning as a holy text that talks back to the faithful without any need of a human mediation. What happens to a religion of texts when the texts start talking? Now, since Judaism invests, as I said, authority in the texts, a flesh and blood rabbi cannot just ignore the scriptural arguments of an AI. And human rabbis will very soon find it very difficult to compete with AI's mastery of the Jewish canon. Even if AI is not granted formal rabbinical status, it is likely that at least some humans, including even some rabbis, would turn to an AI rabbi for scriptural guidance and inspiration. The result might be surprising new developments in very old religions or the emergence of entirely new religions. Now, these kinds of developments have enormous positive potential. They can help humanity in countless ways, from inventing new medicines to preventing catastrophic climate change. But, of course, AI also poses many threats. So let's move on to the second question of what is the threat of AI. The basic problem with AI is not that it is evil. The problem is that it is alien and therefore unpredictable and untrustworthy. At the heart of the AI race, there is a paradox of trust. Humans find it difficult to trust one another, especially as the world is becoming a collection of hostile fortresses. But the people who develop AI somehow manage to believe that we could trust the AIs. When I meet the people who lead the AI revolution, I normally ask them two questions. First, I ask them, why are you moving so fast when there are such huge risks? And the response almost everybody gives is the same. They say, we agree. We know that there are big dangers, and it would be best to proceed with more care. However, if we slow down while our competitors in the other company or in the other countries won't slow down, they will win the AI race, and the world will be dominated by the most ruthless people. We cannot trust our human competitors, so we must move as fast as possible. Then I ask the second question. Do you think you could trust the super intelligent AIs that you're developing? And the same people who just told me they can't trust the human competitors suddenly assure me that they could trust the super intelligent AIs. And this is such a paradox, because we have thousands of years of experience with human beings. We have a broad understanding of human psychology and biology, of the human craving for power, of the tricks humans use to gain power, and also of the forces that keep the human pursuit of power in check. We have also made considerable progress in finding ways to build trust between humans. 100,000 years ago, people lived in tiny bands of just a few dozen individuals and couldn't trust anybody outside their band. Today, there are nations like Brazil with hundreds of millions of citizens, and there are even bigger networks of cooperation linking all 8 billion humans on the planet. Complete strangers often grow the food we eat and invent and develop the medicines that keep us healthy. Of course, we are far from completely solving the problem of human trust, and there are still many tensions and conflicts and wars in the world, but with humans, at least we understand the challenge we are facing. In contrast, we have almost no experience with super intelligent AIs. We have just created the very first prototypes. We already know that even primitive AIs can lie, manipulate, and adopt goals and strategies that were not foreseen by their human developers. We have no idea what will happen when millions of super intelligent AIs interact with millions of humans, and it is even more difficult to predict what will happen when millions of super intelligent AIs interact with one another, creating AI societies, AI tribes. What kind of goals will they develop? What kind of tricks might they invent? True, at present, it is humans who develop the AIs, so we can try to design them in a way that will make them safe for humanity. But remember that a machine is an AI only if it is capable of learning and changing by itself, making decisions by itself, and inventing new ideas by itself. So no matter how human designs them originally, the AIs can then change in a radical and unpredictable manner. And it's a huge gamble to simply trust that these super intelligent alien intelligences will always remain our obedient servants. The humans who despair of trusting other humans, yet think they can trust these alien intelligences, may be making a very, very big mistake. Now, I know that it's sometimes hard for people to understand how AIs might escape human control. Due to the influence of science fiction, when we talk about AIs escaping our control, people tend to imagine a scenario of killer robots running in the streets, shooting people. While something like this is actually already happening in some places like Ukraine and like Gaza, this is nevertheless the wrong image. If you want to understand how AIs can escape our control, don't think about killer robots. Think about business corporations. What are corporations? Corporations like Microsoft or SpaceX or Petrobras are non-human agents. Though they don't have a body or a mind, these corporations can open bank accounts, can hire people, fire people, lobby politicians, and do many, many other things. Now, previously, this corporate agency was just a legal fiction, a fantasy of lawyers. Why? Because in practice, every decision made by Microsoft or Petrobras was actually made by some human being, not by the corporation. Every decision was made by some human executive, human shareholder, human engineer. But with AI, corporate decisions will increasingly be made by a non-human intelligence, a non-human agent. Imagine a corporation that has no human executives and no human shareholders, only AI executives and shareholders. This corporation can make billions and reshape the world. A practical question already today in 2025 is, do we want as a society to allow such things? This is a practical question. Do we as a society allow AIs to open bank accounts, to manage corporations, to trade and invest, to hire people, to lobby politicians? So let us move to the last question. How can humanity flourish in the era of AI? To survive and flourish, we need to remember two lessons from history. First, power isn't happiness. We humans have been extremely good in acquiring power, but so far we have not been very successful in translating power into happiness. That's why today we are thousands of times more powerful than in the Stone Age, but humans are not thousands of times more happy. That's also why the most powerful people in the world, like Trump and Musk and Xi and Putin, are definitely not the happiest people in the world. Secondly, to survive and flourish, we should remember also that intelligence isn't wisdom. Humans are the most intelligent animals on the planet, and at the same time, we are also the most deluded animals on the planet. No other animal can believe the kind of nonsense that humans can believe. For example, my home region of the Middle East is burning in a horrendous war, fueled in part by the most ridiculous fantasies you can imagine. Humans there, on all sides of the conflict, seriously believe that the creator of the universe commanded them to fight and kill other humans. And they also seriously believe that the creator of the universe will reward them for their violence with everlasting joy and bliss in heaven. No chimpanzee will ever believe such nonsense. But many highly intelligent humans believe it. So power isn't happiness, and intelligence isn't wisdom. AI will be more powerful and more intelligent than us. But the power of AI doesn't mean it will bring happiness, and the intelligence of AI doesn't mean that AI will be free from delusions. In fact, a super intelligence might very well be super deluded. Therefore, the big challenge for business leaders and innovators is not how to create more powerful and more intelligent technology. Rather, the challenge is how to develop the wisdom necessary to use all this power and intelligence for good purposes. How to do it? The answer is quite simple. Build more trust between humans before developing super intelligent AIs. Do you know why planet Earth is nevertheless ruled by humans and not by chimpanzees? Not because we are more intelligent than the chimpanzees. Humans rule the world because we know better than any other animal how to build trust with strangers and cooperate in very, very large numbers. We have developed this ability for thousands of years. Unfortunately, just when we need human trust more than ever before, many of our most powerful leaders are busy destroying this trust. Instead of strengthening connections between all humans, they are busy building walls between humans. If humanity is divided, AI will escape our control and will enslave or even annihilate us. On the other hand, if humanity cooperates, we can together develop AI and other technologies in a safe and responsible way. Think about AI as humanity's common child. When we educate children, we know that children learn from what we do, not from what we say. If you tell your child, don't lie, and then the child observes you lying, the child will also lie. Similarly, if you're a tech tycoon developing a super intelligent AI, and you're telling the AI, don't lie, and the AI then observes you lying, the AI will also lie. And if you tell the AI, be compassionate to people, but the AI observes you engaged in a ruthless pursuit of power, the AI will also grow up to pursue power ruthlessly without any compassion. This is why we must first solve the problem of human trust and only then develop super intelligent AI. If AI is developed in a cooperative way by compassionate and trustworthy humans, then the AI too is much more likely to grow up to be cooperative, compassionate, and trustworthy. And all of you have a role to play in that. You are leaders and innovators. Amidst the growing political chaos in the world, the business leaders and the tech innovators still have very considerable power to shape the world. So use your power to build trust between humans. Use your power to build a world which isn't just a card game between ruthless warlords. Build a world in which the dignity of everybody still counts. Thank you.